Right now, there is one big question. Who was in the barrel? Boaters making a disturbing discovery along the shore of Lake Mead.
Well, that's right, and it comes from two retired police officers. They host a show called Problem Solvers, and their goal with this is to try to find some more bodies that potentially could be out here, bring some justice for families and friends that are still here. And police told us earlier this week it is very possible that there could be more bodies that are found as just those lake levels drastically lower.
May 1st, 2022. A boater on Lake Mead looks down into the mud near Hemingway Harbor and sees something poking out of a rusted, corroded barrel. It's a shoe, then a bone. Inside that drum is a human being, shot and hidden here sometime in the 1970s or the early 80s. Within 4 months, 3 more sets of remains surface in other corners of the same lake. A homicide lieutenant tells reporters he never dreamed he would see the water this low in his lifetime. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The bodies weren't the strangest thing this lake gave up. As the water kept falling, down and down and down, something else began to rise out of the mud. Rooftops, foundations, a schoolhouse, and beneath that, something that had been hidden so long, so completely, that most people who live within an hour of it have never even heard its name. Something that was already ancient before the United States existed. Something that makes the Hoover Dam, one of the great engineering marvels of the 20th century, look brand new by comparison. This is the story of a lake built to conquer a desert, and the desert's answer, giving up its dead, its ghosts, and its deep buried memory, all at the same time. Let's start with the crisis that made all of this possible. Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the United States. When it's full, it stretches back more than 100 miles behind Hoover Dam and holds enough water to cover the entire state of Connecticut a foot deep. It was built in the 1930s when the dam choked off the flow of the Colorado River, and for decades it supplied something like 25 to 40 million people across 7 states, dozens of tribal nations, and part of Mexico with water they could set a clock by. Farms across California and Arizona grow winter vegetables for the entire country using this water. Las Vegas gets roughly 90% of its supply from it. Then the desert stopped cooperating. Beginning around the year 2000, the Colorado River Basin slid into what scientists now call a mega-drought, the driest stretch the region has seen in roughly 1,200 years. Snowpack that should feed the river shrank year after year. Demand from farms and fast-growing desert cities kept climbing regardless, and Lake Mead, the savings account for the entire system, started draining faster than it could ever refill. By July of 2022, the lake had dropped to about 1040 feet above sea level. That's the lowest it had been since the reservoir first filled in the 1930s. Nearly 190 feet below full pool, more than 170 feet lower than it stood back in 1983. Down to roughly 27% capacity, barely a quarter full, in the country's biggest bathtub. And that's when the lake started talking. Sunken boats that had been resting under 150 feet of water for decades bobbed back into daylight. A World War II-era landing craft, once buried nearly 200 feet down and studied by divers only through sonar, sat 2/3 exposed less than a mile from a busy marina. A rusted steel water tank, once used to process concrete during the original construction of the dam, rose out of the shallows like the skeleton of some forgotten machine. And then came the barrels and the bones. Here's the number that should stop you cold. As of this summer, in 2026, Lake Mead sits at almost exactly that same record low mark it hit back in 2022. Federal hydrologists say it's hovering right around 1041 feet, still about 27% full. And the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation's own May 2026 projections warn the lake could fall another 20 feet by the summer of 2027, smashing straight through the old record into territory it has never touched since the dam was first built, which means whatever this lake is about to give up next, it hasn't given it up yet. And Lake Mead isn't some isolated freak accident. It's the largest and most visible symptom of a crisis running the entire length of the Colorado River, from the Rocky Mountains all the way down to the Gulf of California. Its sister reservoir upstream, Lake Powell, has been sliding through the same slow collapse. Together, the two hold back most of the fresh water available to the entire American Southwest, and together, they've lost well over half of what they used to store just a couple of decades ago. Every single year now, water managers from 7 different states sit down and negotiate who gets to keep how much, arguments that used to be settled once a generation and have practically become an annual ritual. But to understand what's really been hiding down there, we have to rewind almost a full century, to the moment engineers first realized this dam was going to drown something nobody expected. In 1924, 2 brothers from the tiny farming town of Overton, Nevada, Faye and John Perkins, were walking the desert soil near the muddy river when they noticed broken pottery and strange low mounds pushing up through the dirt. They brought samples to the governor of Nevada. The governor brought in an archaeologist from back east named Mark Raymond Harrington. What Harrington found wasn't a few scattered artifacts. It was a lost civilization, an enormous complex of underground pit houses and multi-room adobe pueblos stretching for miles across the Moapa Valley, home to ancestral Puebloan farmers who had grown maize, beans, and squash here for over 1,000 years, from roughly the 1st century all the way to around 1250. Evidence of even earlier human activity in the same valley stretches back nearly 8,000 years before that, left by an even older culture archaeologists call the basket makers, who dug their homes straight into the earth and roofed them with brush and log beams. Harrington gave the whole complex a grand name, Pueblo Grande de Nevada. Most people would eventually call it something simpler, the Lost City. Walk through what his crews uncovered, and you start to realize how wrong the phrase middle of nowhere really is. Turquoise that had to be hauled in from mines hundreds of miles to the northeast. Shells worked into jewelry that could only have come from the Pacific coast, carried hand to hand across deserts and mountain ranges, long before horses ever existed in North America. Painted pottery with designs that echo the great Pueblo cultures of what's now New Mexico. This wasn't some isolated farming outpost scratching out a living at the edge of the map. It was a working node in a trade network that stretched across the entire ancient Southwest, and it had been thriving here in the Moapa Valley for longer than England has had a royal family. Here's the crazy idea Harrington had to sell to the government. Dig up an entire ancient metropolis, room by room, artifact by artifact, before a dam under construction just downstream drowned every trace of it forever. Nobody thought there was enough time. In 1928, President Coolidge signed the bill authorizing what would become the Hoover Dam. The clock started ticking the moment ink hit paper. Harrington and his crews, including civilian Conservation Corps laborers and Zuni workers brought in from New Mexico for their traditional building expertise, had a matter of years, not decades, to excavate one of the most significant archaeological sites in the entire American Southwest. This is where it gets brutal. Picture it. Teams working in desert heat well past 100 degrees, racing against rising water they could already see creeping toward the valley floor month by month. Every pit house they mapped was a pit house that might vanish under 60, 80, sometimes over 100 feet of reservoir within a single season. Harrington's crews pulled out painted pottery, turquoise beads, woven cotton cloth, coastal shells traded in from hundreds of miles away, and tools used to mine salt in nearby mountain caves. Proof that this supposedly middle-of-nowhere desert valley had once been wired into trade networks spanning the whole Southwest. And still, they lost most of it. Entire sections of the Lost City were never fully excavated. There simply wasn't time, or funding, or hands enough to save it all. By 1935, the rising waters of the new Lake Mead were already closing over pit houses that had stood since before the fall of the Roman Empire. Just downstream, a second community was living through its own slow-motion ending. St. Thomas, Nevada, was founded by Mormon settlers in 1865, who believed at first they were homesteading in Utah or Arizona territory. A government survey later placed them in Nevada instead, and the state promptly taxed them for 5 years they'd never even known they owed. Most residents refused to pay and left in protest. The ones who stayed built the town back up into a real desert oasis, with farms, a school, a hotel, a grocery store, a post office, and even an ice cream shop, a genuine luxury out in that heat. St. Thomas survived droughts and floods and taxes it never agreed to, but it couldn't survive a dam. As the reservoir crept toward its front doors through the mid-1930s, families packed up and left for good. In June of 1938, the very last holdout, a man named Hugh Lord, paddled a boat away from his own front porch as the water reached it, street. Thomas disappeared completely under roughly 60 feet of water, two communities, one built by 20th century pioneers, one built by farmers 1,000 years before them, both erased by the same rising lake within a few years of each other. For over 60 years, that seemed like the end of the story. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, hit subscribe and tap the bell, because this channel exists to dig up exactly these kinds of true stories buried in plain sight, and you don't want to miss the next one. Here's where it gets interesting. St. Thomas didn't stay buried forever. Lake levels rise and fall in long cycles tied to drought, and every so often, over the decades, the town poked back above the surface. In 1945, former residents held a reunion right there on its dusty, half-drowned streets. It reappeared again in 1962 and stayed exposed for 9 straight years before the water finally reclaimed it. Then it vanished once more from 1972 all the way until 2002. But this time, the drought that started around the turn of the millennium, it never went back under. St. Thomas has now been visible continuously for well over 2 decades. Foundations, a schoolhouse slab, the outline of that little ice cream shop, of all things, sitting in cracked desert dirt where 60 feet of reservoir once stood. The National Park Service now maintains a marked walking trail out to the ruins for anyone willing to drive a bumpy dirt road to reach them. Stand there today and the whole thing feels almost staged for effect. A pale, chalky ring runs along the canyon walls high overhead, marking exactly how much higher the water used to sit, sometimes well over 100 feet above where you're standing. Below that line, nothing but cracked, sun-baked lake beds stretching out toward the horizon, and in the middle of it, low crumbling walls and building foundations poking up like teeth. Visitors walk the same dirt streets Hugh Lord walked out of in 1938, except now there's no water in sight for miles. And then, as the drought deepened further still, dragging the lake down past levels it hadn't touched since it was still filling for the very first time in the 1930s, something even older began to reappear along the lost city's flooded edges. Foundations, fragments, pieces of the very Pueblo Harrington's crews never had time to save, nearly a century after they lost the race against the water. What nobody expected was this. The same drought that's terrifying water managers across 7 states is functioning, almost accidentally, as the most powerful excavation tool this region has ever seen. Nature doing archaeology's job for it, for free, and entirely on its own terms. Here's the number that really puts it in perspective. St. Thomas is 161 years old. The lost city's youngest ruins are roughly 775 years old. Its oldest layers of human presence in that valley stretch back nearly 10,000 years. The Hoover Dam, the very structure that supposedly rewrote this landscape forever, is younger than a Ford Model T, 90 years old. A blink of an eye, next to everything it once flooded. The dam didn't erase this history, it just pressed pause on it. And there's a darker layer of resonance running underneath this whole story. One archaeologists have been circling for years now. The ancestral Puebloan communities that built the lost city didn't vanish overnight, and they weren't wiped out by some sudden catastrophe. Across the wider Southwest, researchers point again and again to a familiar culprit behind why so many of these 1,000-year-old farming communities eventually packed up and moved on, sometime around the 1200s. Prolonged, punishing drought. The same river system, the same unpredictable, unforgiving water, a story that rhymes uncomfortably well with the exact crisis playing out along this river today, which raises an uneasy question the lake itself almost seems to be asking us. Are we watching history simply resurface here, or are we watching it quietly repeat? It's worth sitting with that for a second, because the parallel isn't just poetic, it's practical. The people who lived in the Moapa Valley 1,000 years ago weren't primitive by any measure. They engineered irrigation channels, tracked seasonal flooding, and adapted their farming to a river that could swing wildly from generous to bone dry within a single generation. For centuries, it worked. And then, according to the tree ring records and soil studies archaeologists still study today, a drought settled in that simply didn't let up long enough for that system to hold. People moved. Communities dispersed. The Moapa Valley eventually emptied out, long before any Mormon settler or any dam engineer ever set foot in it. So what actually happens with all of this, once it surfaces? Some of it becomes a warning, Of the 4 sets of remains found in 2022, 3 have since been identified through DNA testing. A man who drowned back in 1974, another who drowned in 1998, one more in 2002. Investigators still believe at least one of those 4 deaths was a homicide from the mid-1970s or early 80s, and that particular case remains unsolved to this day, the victim still unnamed. Grim proof that a shrinking lake doesn't just uncover ancient farmers and pioneer schoolhouses, it also settles old scores nobody ever thought would see daylight again. But most of what's surfaced here has become something closer to a gift. St. Thomas now draws hikers and history lovers down that bumpy 3-mile dirt road to walk among ruins that, for most of the last century, no living person could have ever laid eyes on. An hour's drive away, in the town of Overton, the Lost City Museum, built back in 1935 directly on top of an excavated pueblo, still displays the pottery, the jewelry, and the woven cloth that Harrington's crews raced the rising water to save. It's now listed on the National Register of Historic Places, a monument literally built from a rescue mission, standing on the very ground it was built to protect. And the science hasn't stopped either. Every additional foot the lake drops exposes new foundations, new fragments, new pieces of a farming culture that thrived in this exact valley for over 1,000 years, using nothing but the same unpredictable desert river we're all fighting over today. Researchers now get a rare, involuntary window into exactly how earlier civilizations adapted, and eventually didn't, to a landscape slowly running short on water. Meanwhile, the crisis exposing all of it keeps deepening. That 2027 projection of a brand new record low isn't some far-off hypothetical, it's already baked into federal water planning right now, this year. Nevada, Arizona, and Mexico are already operating under mandated cutbacks to their water allotments. Engineers openly discuss a grim milestone known as dead pool, the point at which the lake would drop so low that water could no longer physically flow through the dam's intakes at all, cutting off both water delivery and hydroelectric power to millions of homes downstream. We're not there yet, not even close. But for the first time since the 1930s, it's a number people actually track, week by week, the way you'd watch a patient's vital signs, which means the story of what Lake Mead is hiding isn't finished. It might not even be halfway told. Here's the bigger picture. A single reservoir, built to tame a wild river for the growing cities of the American Southwest, has quietly become an accidental time capsule holding 2 entirely separate buried worlds at once. One is barely older than most of our own grandparents, a pioneer farming town with an ice cream shop and a post office. The other predates the founding of the United States, the fall of the Roman Empire, and even the wheel first arriving in North America. Both were drowned by the exact same dam, within just a few years of each other. Both are re-emerging now because of the exact same drought, and somewhere in the cracked mud between them sits a truth that's easy to miss in all the noise about barrels and bones. This lake isn't just shrinking, it's remembering. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the drought keeps deepening, and every federal forecast right now says it will, what do you think Lake Mead gives up next? More warnings from our own recent past? Or older ones, from a civilization that faced this exact same river, this exact same drought, over 1,000 years before the first drop of concrete ever touched the Colorado? Drop your guess in the comments below. I read every single one.